Hello everyone, welcome back to my positional ranking series here. We're going to be grading every team in the NFC South roster and how each position group stacks up against the other teams in the division. The NFC South may not be the highest end talent division, likely going to be considered the weakest division in the NFL for this upcoming season, but it's still very competitive, it's very close. I think that really you could make the argument that any of the four teams could be competing for that playoff spot in this division, so we're going to be going over every roster spot, lots of changes for some of these teams as well. So we're just going to dive right into the quarterback position here. It's a very questionable quarterback division. I definitely think that there are big time question marks all across the board, but ultimately I am going to put the Falcons and Kirk Cousins up at number one. Kirk Cousins did have a major injury last year, only played in 8 games. He did have 18 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, was well on his way to a really another productive season. I mean, he's been really, really good for Minnesota, especially under Kevin O'Connell, and they're kind of hoping to bring over a similar offense with Zach Robinson here in Atlanta. Not to mention you have Michael Penix, who they obviously think very highly of, drafted him in the top 10 this year. Also have Taylor Heineke, so you've got good depth in case Kirk Cousins isn't fully set to go or he has setbacks. Right now, I think Cousins is the most proven, but that being said, he is 35 coming off a major injury, so there's definitely still question marks at that spot for the Falcons. Then we are going to go with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Baker Mayfield. He certainly had a nice resurgence to his career. In Tampa Bay, 34 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, had 4,700 yards, was super productive. Now, ultimately, he was still very inconsistent. He had 26 turnover-worthy plays, a 3.3 percentage, certainly higher up there, but, he was just kind of that streaky, inconsistent quarterback, but he really did very well within Dave Canales' offense here in Tampa Bay, led them to the playoffs, and ultimately, was able to be very productive this past season. It's a big improvement from his year of the year before, and some of the ending years within Cleveland as well, was really getting back to some of that big-time success he had early on in his career. I do think that ultimately it is going to be something that he has to prove that he can continue to operate and be a productive player outside of Dave Canales' offense now that he has gone and become the head coach of their division rival in the Panthers. But I do think Baker has earned a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. His high-end play, I do think, is better than Derek Carr and the Saints, who we're going to talk about next. I just think Carr has become kind of the epitome of mediocrity at the quarterback position. Is he the worst quarterback in the world? No, absolutely not. He's a competent level starter, but that's really the most that you're going to get out of him. He absolutely folds when the pressure is in his face. I don't think he's much of a creator outside of the structure of the play. If he has a clean look, yes, he can absolutely deliver it. I think he's a good leader, but ultimately, do I think that he is going to elevate any team beyond the roster talent on that team? No, I really don't. And so I do think Carr just provides a big time cap on your ability as a contender. I absolutely don't think that any team that Derek Carr is the quarterback of are going to be competing for Super Bowls, really regardless of how good that roster is. So I'm going to put Carr at 3. He's still a pretty good quarterback. He put up pretty good numbers, but I ultimately just don't think that he's more than just a complete system quarterback that cannot elevate the players around him. Then we're going to put Bryce Young and the Panthers at number 4. Obviously, they need Bryce Young to work out. In order for this team to have any success, they've invested pretty much wholeheartedly into Bryce Young this offseason. It wasn't pretty the last year in his rookie season, but he had just atrocious protection up on his offensive line. His wide receivers were not getting any separation at all. It was just a tough situation for Bryce Young to be in. I think his coaching staff was really bad as well. So you bring in Dave Canales, you bring in some new weapons who we'll talk about as well later on. But I think Bryce Young has a much better chance of being successful this year, but he absolutely has to show it. All 3 of these other guys in the division have at least shown that they can be solid NFL quarterbacks. Bryce Young, first overall pick, he absolutely needs to show that he can be at least that this season. But as of right now, we haven't seen it, even though I think he could very easily finish second on this list by the end of the year. I still believe in Bryce Young. Right now, based on what he's shown on tape, you got to put him at number 4. Next up, moving to the running back position, I'm going to go with the Falcons at number 1. Not only do they have Bijan Robinson, who I get didn't necessarily have the most amazing rookie year. A lot of people, including myself, thought he would burst onto the scene and be one of the best rushers in the NFL early on. I think he showed great things. He had a 4.5 yards per carry, had 4 touchdowns, almost 1,000 yards. So I thought he showed some good things. He just wasn't out there a ton. It was a really weird personnel decisions from Arthur Smith across the board. And once again, I do think that Bijan Robinson has the talent. I mean, he was the highest graded running back I've ever watched coming out of Texas, so I still certainly believe in him. Not to mention you have Tyler Algier, who was an 1,000-yard rusher just a few years ago in his rookie season. You have Jason McClellan and a couple other guys as well. I think it's a really, really talented running back room. I do expect Bijan Robinson in probably a more heavy workload this upcoming year in Zach Robinson's offense. I expect him to have a monster year and be a really, really good player for this team, who I do think could rely on him, especially with Kirk Cousins coming back from a major injury, to be that kind of dominant workhorse on offense. Then I'm going to go with the Saints up next. Alvin Kamara, still a very good running back. He's not, that completely dominant top 5 runner like he was earlier on in his career, but he's still really good. He's a great receiving back. He can make guys miss. He's super elusive. I also think that they've got some other guys in that room as well that can be pretty interesting. Jamal Williams, just a few years removed from leading the NFL in touchdowns. Keandre Miller showed some juice when he came in as well. So you've got some nice depth pieces behind Kamara, even if he's not quite the same caliber of player that he once was. He's still really, really good. Next, we're going to go with Rachaad White and the Buccaneers. I think that White showed some really nice things. He had over 1,000 yards as a rusher, over 500 as a receiver. I thought he was really, really good. He had a lot of touches, but that being said, I do think he has some deficiencies in his game. I think he has pretty poor vision. I don't think he hits the holes super effectively as well. I do think that he is an explosive runner. He's really dangerous when you get him into open space. Just 25 years old, he can still continue to develop a little bit, but I would say that he's clearly third in this division. His versatility is amazing, but I don't think he's a true complete running back like some of the other guys in this division. You also have Bucky Irving, who I wasn't huge on, but you bring him in. He's kind of Rachaad White-esque. Still have Chase Edmonds, Sean Tucker as well. So some other depth pieces, but ultimately Rachaad White is going to be the kind of the workhorse back of this backfield. Then we have the Panthers. Jonathan Brooks most likely is going to be the main running back for this team. He is coming off a major injury as well, an ACL tear that he suffered at Texas. So hopefully he's able to come back and be a nice player for them. You also have Chuba Hubbard, who is a perfectly fine RB2 type. Miles Sanders was really awful in his first year in Carolina, which, they way overpaid for him. But he's still there. You have Blackshear, Rashad Penny as well. I don't think it's a great running back room. You're hoping Jonathan Brooks can really hit the ground running and be a good player for you as that true RB1 he was drafted to be, but we'll ultimately see. Can't rate a rookie too high, especially when you have some other really good running backs in this division. Next, for the wide receiver position, it's got to be the Buccaneers. Mike Evans continues to just be that absolute stalwart of consistency. He had over 1,000 yards again. That continues his streak ever since he came into the NFL. Not to mention he had 14 touchdowns for Baker Mayfield and this offense. I mean, he was absolutely exceptional for this team last year. Chris Godwin is also still on this team and very, very good, especially in the slot, the middle of the field. He's incredibly dangerous in that area. Trey Palmer is your true field stretcher, 6th-round pick in 2023. You also drafted Jalen McMillan, who's probably going to replace Godwin long-term, but he's another good, powerful slot that's not afraid to take a shot over the middle of the field. Have Sterling Shepard, Raheem Jarrett, who was an interesting player out of Maryland back in 2023 as well. So I really like a lot of the depth on this wide receiver room, but Godwin and Evans continue to be one of the best wide receiver duos in the NFL. So clearly going to put the Buccaneers at number 1. Then we're going to go with the Saints at number 2. I think there's a big drop-off here. Chris Olave was an 1,000-yard receiver last year. I thought he showed some really nice things. Not to mention, you also have other guys in this room that I think are really solid, at least rotational pieces. It's probably more wide receiver 3 types. I'm not sure you have a true wide receiver like alpha number 1. I think Olave is a great Z type of receiver, create lots of separation. He's a good deep threat as well. You don't necessarily have that dominant X receiver, but A.T. Perry, I think he showed some good things with his size, had a couple of touchdowns, especially down the stretch. Raheed Shaheed is just an electric playmaker with the ball in his hands in the slot. Also have some other guys, Equinemius St. Brown, Bub Means, who drafted in the 5th round this year, Cedric Wilson, who brought over from Miami. So there's some decent players in this Saints room. Olave is definitely the headliner of this group. I don't think it's absolutely amazing. I would say it's probably a bottom half of the NFL receiving core, but not sure anyone outside of the Buccaneers in this division really have amazing player makers at the wide receiver spot. Gonna go with the Panthers up next, and Falcons fans might not like that, but I think the biggest thing with the Panthers right now is just their complementary skill sets. You have Adam Thielen, who's a really tough power slot. He's that big slot. He'll catch everything. He'll do the dirty work in the blocking game. You have Xavier Legette, who's drafted to be your true field stretcher. He's a big vertical threat. He has great speed. He's really good with the ball in his hands as well. Then you trade for Deontay Johnson, who's one of the best pure separators in the NFL. Yes, he has major drop issues, but I think he was in a terrible situation in Pittsburgh for his skill sets. Kenny Pickett was not able to get the most out of him. I think he grew frustrated. Understandably so, but he's a really good separator, and I think he'll be a nice player for Bryce Young. Not to mention you still have Jonathan Mingo, who is a second-round pick, Terrace Marshall, Amir Smith-Marset. There's some decent players in this Panthers wide receiver room. I get it. It was a terrible group last year, but I think it's much improved, and you've got 4 or 5 guys that I think can be real good contributors for this team this year. And then we have the Falcons at number 4, and Drake London's really good. Don't get me wrong. He's really, really good. And I think that he is underrated across a lot of league circles, but that being said, I think their wide receiver room outside of him is pretty much a complete disaster. Darnell Mooney is an okay option. He is far removed from that 1,000-yard season he had for the Bears a few years ago and really hasn't been able to even come close to matching that production again. Rondale Moore is just a pure yak guy and just design touch player. He's nothing really more than that. You have Kaderil Hodge, Ray McLeod, Casey Washington. This is probably, if you took Drake London out of this wide receiver room, it would be by far the worst wide receiver room in the NFL. Put Drake London in there, who I think is a 1B receiver. I don't think he's quite evolved into a true alpha yet. I think he's a top 20 or so wide receiver in the NFL. That's just not enough to overcome the complementary skill sets that the Panthers have and kind of the other proven guys the Saints and Buccaneers have as well. So that's why the Falcons are at number 4. Would certainly understand if you disagree. Let me know in the comments down below how you would have these wide receivers ranked. But moving to tight ends, Falcons fans will like me a lot more now. Kyle Pitts, I think, clearly is number 1 in this division. I understand, it's hard to put Kyle Pitts as highly as he was drafted as kind of one of these top tight ends in the NFL when he's not having amazing production. He had 667 yards, 3 touchdowns last year, but Arthur Smith just chronically underutilized Kyle Pitts in his skill sets. He needs to be a big slot guy. He needs to be somebody that is constantly being put in space, lining up against linebackers, safeties. He's going to have such a giant mismatch against them. Or against smaller slot corners, he can absolutely just win at the point of attack as well. I think he's a really good player. He just hasn't gotten the opportunity to really kind of thrive in a role that will suit him super well. I think Zach Robinson will do a much better job utilizing him against specific matchups, and he'll have a year closer to his rookie season when he had over 1,000 yards as well. So I still do very much believe in Kyle Pitts, even if he hasn't lived up to the 4th overall draft type as of yet. Then we're going to go with the Buccaneers. Cade Otton really delivered on a pretty nice season, had some solid stats, was just reliable underneath security blanket for Baker Mayfield over the middle of the field. I think that he showed some really good things. O'Keefe, Payne Durham, both also, at least useful tight ends behind him. So I think that Cade Otton showed some really solid things, is certainly on the come up as well. So that's going to put the Buccaneers at number 2 for that room. Up next for the tight end position, we are going to go with the Saints. You have Juwan Johnson, who did take a step back in his touchdown production, no doubt about it, from the previous year. Have Foster Moreau, who definitely is hopefully going to be better after coming back from major medical scares. You have Taysom Hill, Dallin Holker also on this team. I do think that this group lacks a true number 1 tight end for sure, but I think you've got some depth, and been a versatility among this group that, you can do a lot of different things. It's probably not going to be a major issue on this team, but I don't know that it's a major asset as well. Then we're going to have the Panthers at number 4. Tommy Tremble, I honestly think did show some decent things, especially kind of beyond what his numbers were last year, but still you can't rate him too highly. He wasn't super productive. You have Jatavian Sanders, who I do believe will be a pretty decent player for them. He's got nice athleticism. He was a 4th-round pick. A lot of people expected him to go higher, so you definitely figure that he can turn into a decent player for you. Ian Thomas, Steven Sullivan. Sullivan actually did show some nice things kind of down the stretch when I was watching Bryce Young's tape, so I do think that this group has some interesting pieces here and there, but I do think it clearly has to be at number 4. Moving to the offensive lineup next, going to be the Falcons at number 1. I think this group is just rock solid. You pretty much know exactly what you're getting with this. So that's a huge advantage. Have Jake Matthews, who's just been a super uber reliable player at that left tackle spot. Ever since they drafted him back in 2014, he's pretty much been a just really good, consistent player. He's not a amazing left tackle. He's not going to be in the conversation for one of the best tackles in the league, but I do think he's just rock solid. Matthew Bergeron showed some decent things at left guard. Sure, he was a little inconsistent, a little up and down, but I thought definitely showed some flashes and it was very well worth taking a second-round swing on. Drew Dahlman, a great run blocker, especially in kind of that wide zone scheme, which they'll be running a lot of with Zach Robinson at the helm, Raheem Morris coming over from the Rams. So you figure that he'll be a nice fit there. Maybe not quite as good in pass protection, but I think he'll be really effective in the running game. Chris Lindstrom, one of the best guards in the game. Enough really said there. He's just super reliable with pretty much everything that he can do. And McGarry did take a step back kind of from that contract year 2 years ago, but I still thought was a good player at right tackle. So there's not a lot of depth. You have Storm Norton, who's been a complete liability pretty much every time he's stepped on the field. Tyler Vrabel, a couple other guys, but the starting 5 is really good. The depth is definitely questionable, to say the least, but I think that's good enough to get them this number 1 ranking in the NFC South. Then at number 2, might be a little bit surprising, but I'm actually going to go with the Carolina Panthers at number 2. They played horribly last year, this offensive line group, but really only 2 guys from this group that played last year will be back, and that's the 2 tackles. Ike Ekwonu definitely gave up some bad sacks and some big pressures. Thought he was still good in the running game for the most part, and I think the pass protection, he had terrible guard play next to him. There was definitely some inconsistencies he has to clean up, but I do think that there's still a lot of talent in there that made him a top 10 overall pick just a few years ago. I think there's a lot of good within Ike Ekwonu's tape. When he just lost, it was really ugly, so he's got to get much better. Frank Reich's offensive line played really poorly the past couple of years, so I'm certainly curious if they can rebound in that way. But not to mention, Tyler Moton, still a really good right tackle, kind of like Jake Matthews. Maybe not going to be one of the best right tackles in the entire NFL, but I do think he gives you some good consistency in that regard. And then the interior should be just massively upgraded. The guards that they put out there last year were just atrocious. I mean, they were just rotating through guys. It didn't matter who was out there. They were all terrible. You look at their PFF grades. Obviously, PFF grades aren't everything, but they're hilariously low. It's truly impressive how bad this interior was last year. So they go out and they sign 2 giant big money guards. Damian Lewis, who I think will be a just really good, consistent, solid addition coming over from Seattle to play the left guard spot. And then you have Robert Hunt, who I think is closer to that Pro Bowl caliber right guard, and I think he's shown great versatility when it comes to schemes. Was really good within the wide zone scheme that Miami ran with Mike McDaniel. Was also really good in the power running game that they kind of had before McDaniel was brought in. So I think he showed some great things. Austin Corbett currently set at center. He definitely dealt with a lot of injuries last year, but I think when they brought him over from the Rams a few years ago, they knew that he could be at least a solid level starter, and I expect that that's probably what they'll get out of him. Don't have a ton of depth. Yosh Nijman is one of the better swing tackles in the NFL, bringing him over from the Packers. Never thought he was a complete liability whenever he played, which is what you'd love to see from swing tackles. You also have Brady Christensen, who I think can play a lot of different spots. Chandler Zavala and Cade Mays looked really rough when they played last year on the interior, but they do at least have some starting experience and maybe can turn into things as young players, but ultimately you're probably not relying on them too much. I think the starting 5 is pretty good. The depth, you have at least a couple of players that may be all right for you if they have to come in. So I'm going to put the Panthers at number 2. There's definitely some inconsistencies, though. Buccaneers are going to go at number 3. I think that Tristan Wirfs is proving to be, just an amazing tackle. Left side, right side, doesn't matter. That switch didn't really bother him. He was still an exceptional Pro Bowl, all-pro caliber left tackle. And Luke Goedeke looked really good at right tackle, moving back outside from the interior where they kind of pushed him into. He's much more natural in space, where he can mirror guys, where he's not going to be as overwhelmed by like 320-pound nose tackles. I think is a much better role for him. The interior is going to be a bit of a question mark. Ben Bredeson, I think, is not one of the better starters in the NFL, to say the least. Cody Mock had some really rough moments as a rookie. I thought he showed some decent things, but definitely question marks there. And then you have Graham Barton slated to start at center. I wasn't as high on Graham Barton as other people were, but I still think that he'll pretty easily slot into that center spot and be a really good player for them. So you don't have amazing depth here. You've got Robert Hainsey. You have some other guys, but mostly your starting five is just all right for you in the middle, and then I think it's pretty decent on the tackle spots as well. So you've got some interesting pieces for sure. It's a pretty young group. Then we're going to put the Saints at number 4. Tulise Fuaga is currently slated most likely to start at left tackle. Definitely think that's just a question mark. It's not necessarily something where I don't believe he can do it, but he played on the right side. He's kind of more of that stiffer run-blocking mauler type. So he's going to be in charge of Derek Carr's blind side. He'll definitely just need to adjust to kind of the length and speed of the NFL on the outside, and switching hands and everything as well when it comes to coordination is going to be just at least a change. Then you have Nick Saldivieri, who drafted out of Old Dominion in the 4th round last year. I think that he's, an interesting piece, that he's likely going to be slated to start, but definitely a big unknown there. Eric McCoy is really good at center. Cesar Ruiz, I just never think has lived up to that first-round pedigree, but he's an okay player. And then Ryan Ramczyk at right tackle is just a gigantic question mark. Age, injury concerns, durability, all that is just completely up in the air. If he can't play, that means that Trevor Penning is either going to have to play on the right side, or you're going to kick Fuaga to the right side and play Penning on the left side. Penning has been atrocious pretty much whenever he's played, so that's not great. You do have Shane Lemieux, Lucas Patrick, some other guys in that group that are available to you, but I don't think it's one of the better offensive lines in the NFL, to say the least. Moving to the defensive side of the ball, this edge group for this division is truly horrible. I mean, none of these teams are probably even outside of the bottom 10 when it comes to edge rushers in the NFL. I'm going to put the Saints at number 1. Carl Granderson at least has shown some pretty decent things. He's been pretty good for them. Cam Jordan is still a really good, smart player, but he's definitely on the decline. He's not the same player that he once was, or really even close to it. I do like some of the other intriguing pieces, though. Chase Young, brought over from San Francisco, obviously was on Washington before. Maybe they can unlock something with him. Peyton Turner, another young edge rusher who you drafted early on, first round in 2021. Maybe he can turn into something. Didn't play much last year just due to injury. Isaiah Foskey, a second-round pick. I don't think it's a very high-end talent at this point, but I do think you have some intriguing depth. Granderson and Jordan at least are solid starters, but this is just a really, really weak division when it comes to the edge rush position. Going to put the Buccaneers up next. Yaya Diaby definitely showed some really interesting things, and I think he could turn into a really good player for them. I do like him, but, you have Joe Tryon-Shoyinka across from him, Chris Braswell, who you drafted in the 2nd round. It's just big-time question marks. Tryon is definitely not lived up to his first-round billing. Braswell, 2nd-round pick. We'll see how he turns out, but definitely, at best, you probably have 3 number 2 rushers on this team, no number 1 caliber rushers, and that's the number 2 team in this division, as you can kind of see how dire it is. The Panthers are going to be at number 3. Jadeveon Clowney pretty much completely carrying this group. He was really, really good for the Ravens last year, but I think Mike McDaniel just did such an excellent job scheming up amazing just stunts and twists, blitzes, things like that for that defensive line. I think, outside of that, DJ Wanham, he was on the field for 1 billion snaps last year, so he did get some decent sack production, but his true, snap to pressure rate, I suppose, is just not very good. And, it's an okay group, but you've got Kayvon Chason, DJ Johnson as depth. None of those guys are super interesting as well. So that's really rough, besides Jadeveon Clowney. And then for the Falcons, we're going to have them at number 4. You just don't have a lot here at all. Arnold Ebiketie, I do think, showed some okay things. I think he's decent. You have Lorenzo Carter, Braylon Trice, Brandon Dorlus is kind of a hybrid edge. Zach Harrison, kind of same thing. You have at least some interesting younger pieces. I don't think you have even close to an edge one, but right now, and I think the other teams have a little bit more high-end talent. Ebiketie, you definitely hope can maybe take that step in year 3, but you certainly can't count on it. And that's a really, really rough edge rush group when it comes to this division, but it's kind of how I see it. But I think you could argue a lot of different ways just because I do think it's relatively close with all 4 of those groups. Then we're going to go with the interior defensive line, and this one was really tough because there's actually a lot of talent on the interior of the defensive line. Going to go with the Buccaneers at 1. You have Vita Vea, who's one of the best nose tackles in the entire NFL. He's really good when it comes to run stuffing, but for his size, he's truly impressive at the pass rush spots as well. And then you have Kalijah Kancey, was a pretty big liability in the running game, unsurprisingly, but he definitely showed some really nice things in the passing game as that true penetrating 3-tech. You have Logan Hall, Greg Gaines, William Golston. It's a deep and pretty talented interior. I think you're going to have kind of specific roles for these guys, but Vea, the high upside of Kancey, and some of the other talent on that defensive line is going to put them at number 1. And then we're going to put the Panthers at number 2. I think Derek Brown is one of the most underrated players in the entire NFL. He's a true 3-down player, can definitely bull rush, has some decent pass rush moves, but he's one of the best run stuffers in the entire game. You can put him anywhere from a 1-tech to a 5, and I think he can be really successful. You have A'Shawn Robinson, Shai Tuttle, some other guys in that group, but definitely carried by how highly I think of Derek Brown. And, it is tough because the Falcons do also have a pretty intriguing interior. Grady Jarrett is not quite the same player that he once was. He's still really good. David Onyemata has been really good for them. You have some interesting pieces. Dorlus, Zach Harrison. You drafted Ruka Rororo, which I think was way too high, but I think he's at least an athletic, interesting player as well. So you maybe don't have the truly dominant number 1 like the Buccaneers and the Panthers do. I think that Grady Jarrett is amazing, but just due to his age, injury concerns, and his play over the last few years, I wouldn't say he's one of the top interior defensive players in the NFL right now like those other guys. He's still great, don't get me wrong, but you probably have to put the Falcons at number 3 just simply because of that. And then you have the Saints at 4, Kalen Saunders, Nathan Shepard, those guys are whatever. And then you have Brian Brzee, who's kind of the interesting one of that group. Obviously a first-round pick last year. Didn't do a ton for them, but I do think he definitely has a ton of traits and is very, very intriguing on that interior there. Christian Boyd was an interesting 6th-round pick out of Northern Iowa as well. Then moving to the linebacker spot, I think that this is a pretty good linebacker division as well. Going to go with the Saints at number 1. Pete Werner and Demario Davis, a great duo. Davis still continues to be just really, really good for this team. I think Werner's a very solid weak side kind of run and chase type linebacker. Also bring over Willie Gay from Kansas City, who is a solid player as well. So Jalen Ford, I think, was an interesting pick as well to add to this group. It's just a very good group for the Saints linebackers that I think can do a lot of different things. They're versatile and definitely can make plays in both the running and passing game. Then we're going to put the Buccaneers up next. Levante David continues to be a really good player. He is losing a step a little bit, but I still think that he's, one of the better linebackers in the NFL. I don't mind at all moving on from Devin White, getting KJ Britt. Devin White, I think, was one of the more overrated players in the entire league. His blitzing ability kept him relevant for a long time, but when it came to coverage and true instincts of playing the linebacker spot, I think it was incredibly overrated. So KJ Britt, I think, is a perfectly fine replacement there. And then Servatia Dennis was a really interesting player out of Pitt last year. Really liked him, so maybe he can turn into a decent 3rd linebacker for you as well. It's going to put the Buccaneers there. Then we have the Panthers up next. I think Josie Jewell and Shaq Thompson, a really good group. Jewell, being reunited with Ejiro Evero, where he played his best football. I think that's a really good destination for him. He's just a solid, consistent linebacker. He's not going to be in any top 10 linebacker rankings, but I think he's a pretty good player. Shaq Thompson coming back from an injury. He is a really good player. I think he could be in the top 10 linebacker conversation based on previous years, but you got to see if he can recover from that injury and, continue to be that caliber of player. So I think it's a really good group. though, you have not a ton behind it. Trevin Wallace was a decent swing in the third round. He's, if he has to go and play, I think, at all this year, he's going to be awful, but he has some good athleticism, some great traits that maybe give him a few years, he could turn into a really nice piece. And then we have the Falcons at number 4. Honestly, not a bad group. Keaton Ellis, I think, is a really good player for them up in the middle. And then Troy Anderson is kind of your run and chase, athletic freak linebacker. He didn't do a ton this past year. You also have J.G. Bertrand, who drafted out of Notre Dame. Some other pieces here, but I think mostly you're going to rely on Ellis and Anderson to be your starting pieces in that linebacker spot. I don't think it's bad at all. Ellis especially is a pretty decent player. Moving to the cornerback position, going to be the Saints at number 1. I don't think this one is particularly close, honestly. You have Paulson Adebo, Marshawn Lattimore, of course, Alontae Taylor, Kool-Aid McKinstry, who you drafted, who, I definitely had a true first-round grade on, so I had no issue at all with them taking him in the second round. I think, honestly, that 4 deep is better than most groups in the entire league. Lattimore is a true lockdown number 1. Adebo has shown some great things being a third-round pick. Alontae Taylor is kind of very well suited for that nickel role. And then McKinstry is a physical outside player. You've got depth. You've got star talent at the top. I think Saints are clearly at number 1 when it comes to that group. Then we're going to put the Panthers at 2. This is obviously assuming that you get a full, healthy season of J.C. Horn, which you definitely can't rely on at this point. But when he's out there, J.C. Horn has looked the part of a top 10 pick like he was drafted to be. Obviously, it sucks that you didn't get Pat Surtain in that draft, but, I feel like anytime J.C. Horn has played, I've been really impressed with him. It's just about durability, being able to stay healthy and consistently be out there for his team. Dane Jackson, I don't think is a big downgrade from Dante Jackson, and getting, a huge playmaker for you in Deontay Johnson, I think that was big. And then Troy Hill is a fine slot corner. Chow Smith-Wade, I think, was an interesting piece out of Washington State they got in the 5th round. You don't have much depth at all in this group, but your starters, J.C. Horn, Dane Jackson, Troy Hill, I think that's a pretty good group for you. The Buccaneers up next. Jamel Dean is kind of your corner 1. Carlton Davis and him were a great duo. I think they've fallen off a little bit, both of them, but Jamel Dean, the only one still on this roster. You have Zion McCollum, who was a 5th-round pick in 2022. Crazy, freaky athlete, but definitely was up and down last year in his first real opportunity to start. You have Christian Izien, who played in the slot for you as a true undrafted free agent. I thought he showed up pretty nicely. I think that, he still has some work to do, but overall, as an undrafted rookie free agent, I thought he showed some really nice things. Bryce Hall you still have as depth as well, so it's not an amazing group. I don't think you have a true corner 1. You maybe have a corner 2 in Jamel Dean. Zion McCollum's an upside play, and there's just some question marks for sure within this group. I don't think you have a true number 1. And then we have the Falcons at number 4. A.J. Terrell has not been the same player that he was a few years ago now, where he was arguably the best cornerback in football. He's still really good, but you have Clark Phillips outside right now, which, he's pretty short to be out there. It's not impossible. You see guys like DJ Reed have success being in kind of that quarters off coverage and being able to be an outside corner at that size, but it's definitely not kind of your prototypical build for being a cornerback. Then you have D. Alford, Mike Hughes, a couple of other guys, but definitely not players that you really consistently believe in. I think A.J. Terrell is still a really good player, but besides that, I think this room is big question marks pretty much all around the board when it comes to depth, other starters. So we're going to put them at number 4 when it comes to the cornerback room. Moving to the safety spot, I think you arguably have the best 2 safeties in the entire NFL in this division, but we are going to go with the Buccaneers up first. You have Antoine Winfield, who is just amazing. I think all pro caliber safety. I would say very arguably the best safety in the entire NFL with his versatility. He can be the single high safety. He can come down and hit. He can guard tight ends one-on-one, be kind of a nickel slot type of player. So much versatility, really talented. But what puts them above the Falcons is kind of their depth in their corner, or their safety too as well. Jordan Whitehead, really solid player from the Jets. Originally was in Tampa Bay, went over to the Jets, now back in Tampa Bay. Also drafted Tyke Smith, who will probably play kind of that star role where he's able to be the nickel player while also being able to be their third safety. So I like that kind of trio of safeties there for the Buccaneers. We are going to put the Falcons up next at number 2. Jesse Bates was just great for this team last year. Definitely one of the best, if not the best, true free safety center fielder in the NFL. As a Bengals fan, it still pains me that we let him go, but he's an absolutely amazing player. DeMarco Hillams stepped into that kind of strong safety role. 7th round pick in 2023. You still have Richie Grant, Dane Cruikshank. It's okay. It's definitely not kind of the same caliber of depth as the Buccaneers have outside of their star safety. So that's kind of what makes the difference between the two of them. But it's still a very solid safety room, to say the least. Then we are going to go with the Saints up next. Tyrann Mathieu still is a really, really good safety. I'll be honest, I kind of figured that he would be washed out at this point just because he's been in the league so long, it feels like. But he's been a very good player for them still. And then you have Jordan Howden, who's been okay for you on the other spot. And then the Panthers, I don't even think have bad safeties either. I just think that they kind of lack the star power that the other teams in this division have. Jordan Fuller, very reliably, just a solid player. Bring him over from the Rams. Xavier Woods from Minnesota as well. I think both of those players are just perfectly solid safeties. Nothing wrong with that at all. Then we have the coaching, which I think is very, very much the hardest thing of this entire division. I honestly think you can make an argument for pretty much any order of these 4 coaching staffs. 2 of them are completely new coaching staffs, and the other 2 existing ones I wouldn't say I'm exactly the highest on either. So really, this one was just kind of based on what I've seen and what I feel like they can accomplish in the future. I have the Buccaneers staff at number 1. I will say I'm not the biggest Todd Bowles fan. I do think bringing in Liam Cohen to replace Dave Canales was a decent move. They have had the most recent success, and they're really the only proven staff within this division. So that's what ultimately gives them the nod. I really like Todd Bowles' kind of aggressive style of defense. I do like him as a defensive coordinator. I wouldn't say I'm super sold on him as a great head coach in the NFL, but I think he's a great defensive coordinator. I'm going to go with the Falcons staff up next. I really like Raheem Morris as a person. I think he's a really good leader. I do really like the Zach Robinson hire as well. And you got to say with Raheem Morris, obviously he coached the Buccaneers super early on, and he kind of got screwed over. He was the youngest head coach in NFL history at that time, and he wasn't very good. He was pretty awful for them. But I think that he has shown a lot of growth over the years. He's become a really good defensive coordinator for a couple of different teams, learned under Sean McVay, has learned under some of the best coaching staffs in the entire NFL. Bringing over Zach Robinson, I think is a great move. I think he could definitely turn into one of the next head coaches in the NFL, just based on what he's done with his time at Los Angeles. And then you have Jimmy Lakey bring in to be the DC as well. So I think it's a really solid, it's well-built coaching staff. Obviously, it's hard to put them so high without them coaching a game yet together, but that's where I'm going to go with them. And I'm going to put the Panthers up next. I really like the Dave Canales hire. I think he did a great job getting the most out of Baker Mayfield. It's a very interesting scheme. His passing concepts especially are really good. They didn't run the ball super effectively with Tampa Bay last year, so he's going to have to prove that he can do that and that he can kind of build a good staff. I think getting Ejiro Evero to stay, whether it was by choice or not, I think that's huge. I think he's one of the better defensive coordinators in the NFL, so I really do believe in at least one of the coordinators for both of those teams, and I think the head coaches were really good hires as well. I will say Dennis Allen, I simply don't believe in. I think he might be my least inspiring head coach in the entire NFL. I think he's a decent defensive play caller, but besides that, I don't think that he is going to get this team where they need to go. Clint Kubiak, Joe Woods, your coordinators on this team. I don't really believe in this staff. I don't believe in them to get the most out of this roster, which I don't think is an amazing roster to begin with. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if Dennis Allen is at least fired this year, and maybe even the first head coach fired this year. So that's ultimately how I have this group stacking up in this division. It's a very close competitive division, even though it might not be the most talented. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you got to this point, please hit that like button while you're down there. It just truly helps push this out to other NFL fans like you, help support the channel. It's a free and easy way to just, click that super quick, and it helps me out so much. While you're down there, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button as well. Going through every division here, going to have 2025 NFL draft coverage, the upcoming NFL season up, tier rankings. You won't want to miss any of it. So please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It would truly mean the world. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one.